Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Debatable with your host, Nina. Today, Kyle's not available. With me, I am joined by one of our motion contributors for Debatable Open 2024. We have Omar with us. Omar is an amazing debater that I have the privilege of working with. We were working together in equity teams, we work together as coaches. They are part of the only Indonesian team so far to have broken in worlds. They are top 10 ESL speaker. They have edge scored a lot of Asian majors and was a world's ESL finals judge. So let's all welcome Omar. Hi, Omar.
Hello. Thank you, Nina, and also Kyle, who is not here for having me.
Today's motions are all about, well, it was supposed to be developmental econ, but as we were looking at the motions, it ended up mostly in labor. And I remember I was chatting with you, Omar, and we said, what is dev econ? But a lot of things, including labor. And I'm not sure. Is this like a motion type that you enjoy personally, Omar? Because I remember I did ask you to make us a set about this, and I want to know like, what's your experience with motions like this in general?
I mean, my background is finance and accounting, not necessarily econ, but because of that knowledge specifically, I have grown some sort of fondness towards econ debates because I think that not only that I can apply my personal knowledge, but also at the same time, I do think that this is the most, I would say, complex in a sense that you need to have some sort of interdisciplinary knowledge in order for you to come up with at least some sort of sensible arguments and logic in the debate. But yeah, so personally speaking, I think this is something that I really like, not only debating, but also judging, and then eventually, well, making as motions. What specifically draws me into this type of motion is not only my personal knowledge, but also how much you really need to learn about the world and also the effects of certain decisions made by people in power or things like that, which makes the whole set is very dynamic. And yes, indeed, we did discuss about making it to be more specific towards development or econ, or at least macro econ in general. But as time progresses, eventually we decided that labor would make more sense, especially my background is also in HR. And I think that some of the motions that we will discuss later are heavily inspired by not only personal experience as an HR worker, but also during my time studying HR during my master's degree.
I do want to ask, right? Because IR, econ, maybe even sports, they are generally themes that a lot of people get intimidated by. So, for instance, you have a lot of knowledge here, your background is here, maybe like in terms of your education as well as your work experience. But for those that are encountering this from a different field or a different perspective, what advice or general tips would you have when they talk about economies or specifically like things related to labor?
That is a very fair question to ask. And yes, indeed, it could be very daunting, like if you're not educated or if you're not exactly aware of how econ works. But then again, the definition of econ is mostly about behavior or how people like interact with different elements in their lives, either with each other or with the overall economic system, with their companies, and also with the national economy or whatever you want to call it. They're all interrelated in a way that even like the most unaware human being when it comes to like econ theories or concepts or principles are still able to argue because that's in essence what econ is all about. It's about how we interact with the system, whether it's in a micro or macro scale, and therefore it's very easy to like understand the logic. For example, the most basic concept of econ would be the theory of supply and demand and their relations with one another, and then we add pricing in the mix of it. But then these are things that even people without, let's say, econ degree would understand. And that's exactly because how personal it is about how we view certain objects or certain elements on daily basis. And that's why I think that the first tips would be not to panic, obviously, because these things are things that we encounter in daily life. And even like the most complex econ motions with that long info slide that you would encounter in debate tournaments, they're essentially like things that you probably have heard as well. Like even when you're not educated in econ, you would know, or you would at least read news or hear news about, oh, the government is going to increase or decrease the interest rate or things like that. And then these things can easily be accessible, in terms of you finding out more without having to have like a specific degree on it. So first, don't panic. Second, just channel your own, I would say, experience in interacting with different economic aspects and how would you react in that sense, and just try to put yourself in other people's shoes. Let's say whether you're a middle class or a lower class or things like that. And then basically your observations would work. And most of the time that your gut feeling when it comes to how I would react, how I would behave when it comes to certain economic incidences or occurrences, most of the time they're correct. Again, because it is a very basic and it's also something related to how you would survive when the government or anyone else would introduce something remotely economic to a certain extent.
Yeah, I think the best thing as well, with complicated rounds is just making it about different relationships, right? Your own relationship with the topic, the relationships you see others have with the economy. So I think that's great advice. I do think a lot of people tend to forget, right, that topics like economics affects everyone. And I think that's the reason it becomes so daunting is we don't realize or we have a hard time putting ourselves in those situations. So I think that brings us
Absolutely.
perfectly to our first motion, which is all about, I would say, a big chunk of it is about like personal experiences of people and their relationship either with other people or their workplace. And the motion reads, this house supports the decline of professional loyalty in the modern workspace. So there's an info slide here. It says that professional loyalty is defined as an intense sense of belongingness towards an organization. So I do want to ask, I think this is the first time I've personally seen a motion about like professional loyalty. I think there are many motions about, like tenure and staying long in a place. But it's the first time I've encountered a motion that says, like the sense of loyalty. So I do want to ask, how did you think of this motion?
Oh, well, so before I work as a full-time debate coach now, and also I would say well-rounded HR professional, I used to specifically work in recruitment, like headhunter, if you will. So then based on that experience, right? I talk to different people, I talk to different employers. They always say that, oh, we don't like people who are jumpy. We don't like people who are like moving places from work from one to another. Well, some people are indeed like, how do I say this nicely? Some people do like the opportunities of getting paid more. That's why they move around a lot. But at the same time, talking to hundreds of people on a weekly basis back then, I would like listen to the experiences of, yeah, I moved because of a lot of reasons. And who are we to judge that these reasons are not valid, right? But then therefore I came up with this motion under the idea that why would employers or a prospective employer immediately judge someone based on how long they spend their time working in a particular place? Sure, the idea of, oh, it's a red flag if they move around so quickly. But at the same time, again, why don't we give them a chance first? Because especially if their skill sets is a match, that's what interviews are for. And then employers would say, but then we are wasting our time if we, let's say, prioritize them. So might as well just move on to people who are like not as jumpy as they are. But that's somewhat oxymoronic because even people who are not, let's say, jumpy also usually interview all the time. So that means they're already seeking for new opportunities regardless, because people try to look for better jobs all the time, right? And it's not just in terms of better compensation, but also better working environment, better boss, or better work-life balance, you name it. It's just like they have not found it yet, so that's why they do not move. But people are always open to opportunities. And it would baffle a lot of employers if, let's say, they are not trying to be oblivious around the fact that their employees might be interviewing, even their most loyal employees. It's just that they haven't moved yet. So I think that in that case, professional loyalty has always been abused as a reason for not giving someone else a chance, especially when, again, as a headhunter, I am the middle person, right? Trying to understand why they're looking for new opportunities. Would they be suitable for the job? And then it just baffles me if like companies are just like, oh, they're too jumpy, no matter how good they are as you are trying to sell them to us. But no is a no. And I was like, yeah, good luck looking for people, especially like who are again, they have different reasons, but it's not only that, right? The reason that why I also put the wording of modern workplace is exactly because the current like working landscape is very different, especially ever since the pandemic era, where people are looking for a more flexible job for
Yeah.
like yeah, there's a rise of freelance jobs as well, or those gig economies or things like that. But not only that, right? Some skills are necessarily much more in demand compared to the others. So that's why companies are trying to poach employees from their competitors, from at least from other companies where the similar job exists. So in that case, this happens all the time. So I thought like, why not set as a debate motion? Like, why should we oppose people who are like jumping too quickly? They might have their valid reasons. So yeah,
Yeah.
sorry for the
Yeah.
explanation.
No, no, don't be sorry. I do agree. Like I lean a bit more towards proposition here, honestly. I think as someone who has a tendency personally to like look for better opportunities and jump around, Like, I don't think our economy is helping, right? Like, I think that's a big part of framing. Would you agree?
100% for sure.
Yeah. So I do want to ask though, you've talked to a lot of companies that have expressed interest for loyalty. And I do agree it can be from a place of wanting to maximize an employee, to put it kindly, but it does kind of overlap a little bit with some sense of abuse. So how would
Mhm.
op frame it to kind of recover from, a very strong framing from proposition that you brought up earlier?
Before that, I think that there's general consensus, especially for companies to really start caring about employees' well-being. Like if you notice, there's also like a rise of, I would say, a mental health provider for employees, in a sense that a lot of companies are more engaging with these opportunities and also service providers, which means that we cannot always, like proposition cannot always rely on the fact that companies will be abusive about loyalty and things like that. So that's the first thing that they need to establish, right?
Mm-hmm.
The second thing that they need to establish is that obviously sometimes people also are somewhat short-termist in a way that they're looking for immediate benefits. So here's the thing, right? When people like, oh, I want to look for better opportunities or better salary. First of all, better salary is not necessarily a good thing, especially like when you are immediately trying to jump into the bandwagon of like, oh, getting better opportunities and all of that. So that's the first thing that that's the second thing that I need to outframe. Secondly, aside from better salary as well, like employees, if anything, if let's say professional loyalty is currently in danger in a sense, companies are starting to realize that they need to put more attention to their employees. And not only in the form of, let's say, providing mental health services, but also trying to engage them more in terms of what are the things that they can do at work to make it more meaningful. Some companies offer more flexibility and also more, I would say, not authority, what's the word? Like autonomy for their employees to seek for something that would make things more meaningful. Companies are starting to provide a very customized or personalized well-being package that is not like a blanket thing. Some people prefer, let's say, pet insurance and all of that. And companies, at least major companies, multinational companies, are starting to realize all of this as well. And because multinational companies are doing this, local companies are trying to offer something to make them to make them have an edge in the employment landscape. So that's why there's this general awareness about all of this. And lastly, the thing that opposition can also frame is that loyalty is indeed necessary, right? If in order for you to, let's say, have a broader responsibility at work. So if you move around quickly and if you're not putting value on loyalty, it's very likely for people to just be stuck in the same position in a way that they're not gaining professional growth in terms of skill sets, in terms of exposure to managerial capabilities, or even, let's say, strategic aspects of the work. Because the more loyal you are and the longer you stay in a company, it's very likely for the company to involve you into like a larger aspect of the business where you get to even make decisions, not just exposed to, let's say, critical business information. So in that regard, it is indeed important, especially if you want to succeed in the long run. So yeah, I think that's what the opposition can establish.
I'm also curious because modern workplace is such a specific wording that you've chosen, and you've explained quite a bit earlier what the difference is. I was also curious, there are different types of companies, big companies, smaller startups, and you've worked with
Mm.
them both. I do want to ask, is there like a difference that the debate will have if, for example, I have a specific argument about startups? And what do you
Yeah.
think the arguments or the framing will be if I chose to focus there?
Well, I mean, modern workplace does implicitly refer to the current trend of startups or tech companies or things like that. But eventually, what they are doing does have some, I would say, influence to a certain extent to older companies, like where, let's say, in the past, consulting firms are not very like well known to be flexible or providing, let's say, some sort of comprehensive well-being package for their employees. But because most of their employees are actually sought after by startup companies, then they realize that they need to change some sort of not policies, but rather probably policies as well, but rather their practices in terms of engaging with their employees. So the modern workplace refers to not just like a specific industry, but rather how the overall understanding of engaging with employees are currently changing because of certain industries being on the rise, then the others will eventually have to not necessarily follow 100%, but adjust some of their practices. But if you want to specify it to startups, that is also possible because, again, they are considered to be like the pioneers of this movement in terms of we don't really care about loyalty. We are going to do our best to provide the best compensation and all of that. So in that case, they are indeed quite important in this debate. But you can also talk about how that specific incidents, I would say, if you will, are also influencing like the larger landscape of how people view work today and how employers view the way they should engage with their employees in a larger scale.
Yeah, so I think I have a clear picture of how it might affect, the employee or the person looking for opportunities or choosing to stay. I am curious though, how does this affect like a company's overall mindset? You did mention that there is on both sides this discussion on how will companies react. But I do want to see or imagine, what does a workplace look like when loyalty takes a backseat? Wouldn't that, I imagine that would be good for prop in a way, because we are now looking like at what you mentioned, their abilities, the meritocratic contributions. But
Mhm.
wouldn't that also be difficult for companies, for example, to balance the interests of their employees? Like, I'll feel bad, for example, if a newcomer like gets more promotions despite the length of my stay there. So wouldn't that also be a factor? And how do you think companies would manage that, or like talk about a way of balancing those different interests?
That is a very good question. But here's the thing, because we're talking about labor, it's inseparable to like the overall concept of talent management or how companies or employers manage their talents, right? So in that regard, this process is all interconnected. When, let's say, there is a decline in professional loyalty, that means that your recruitment team needs to be very dynamic. But at the same time, when recruitment team is very dynamic, then it's very likely that for you to have like, let's say, a lot of HR people specifically for recruitment. But then the effects do not stop there, because that means that your onboarding policies are also going to be like very, very rigid, or even like, let's say, too dynamic. So it could be two of those, depending on the nature of the business. But at the same time, that you're going to allocate a lot of resources, manpower, and all of that into not only onboarding, but when, let's say, you're onboarding or welcoming new employees, you have to think about their succession planning. What would this position be in the next few months or even the next few years, right? So some companies are just like not so careful in terms of planning the manpower that they need to recruit, because people keep on leaving or things like that. It's usually also because of, I would say, management that is not so careful when it comes to determining how many positions they really need to achieve a certain goal. And because of that, if it's on decline, then it's very likely for the turnover of the employees to affect the overall, let's say, long-term growth of that particular position, because all the companies care about is just refilling vacant positions. And because of that, not so much attempts or resources are going to be put in terms of, let's say, having a sustainable and long-term career for any particular position. So that would be like one of the downsides of us not caring about professional loyalty. But at the same time, if you put too much emphasis there, it's very likely that you're also going to, let's say, prioritize more senior employees to achieve senior positions or to be promoted, like you said, right? And if anything, that the situation where, let's say, a new employee suddenly just came in and then they got like a higher position than someone who has already spent too much time there, it's also a result of poor planning from the companies. Like, why are they not putting too much emphasis on employees who have been there for a long time? If they think that the employees are not, quote unquote, fulfilling the criteria, then probably the companies are also accountable in terms of not providing enough learning and development policies. Again, another thing that is correlated to the overall human resources management process. So in that regard, whether professional loyalty is on decline or not, it plays a huge impact on how companies would determine their overall talent management policies. So that's why it could go either way.
All right, I think we can start to wrap up this motion. I do have one final question, which is, I think, there's so many angles to focus on either side. If you
Yep.
had to boil it down, what's the most strategic angle or focus for prop, and what do you think would be the strategic focus for opposition?
I think for proposition, obviously, it's more about appreciation for employees' talents, about how the world and the economic condition today is very dynamic when it comes to certain skill set or talents, or also, let's say, capabilities. And in that case, professional loyalty is something that would be in the way for companies to recruit the best talents, just because they have, I would say, a stigma towards people who jump around a lot. So in that case, the strategic focus on why then it actually opens more opportunities to hire the best talent. So that would be the first one. And the second one is the individual benefits for workers. That would be for proposition. For opposition, I think at the same time, they can also argue why then, let's say, the decline will affect the mentality of modern workers in a very negative way, and why then it will not result in any long-term benefits for that particular worker. And then they will just have to frame why then long-term benefit, and making employees realize how important it is would be one of the best ways to approach demotion and for opposition.
All right, thank you very much. I think we can move on now to our second motion in this set. And it reads, this House believes that workers should be compensated based on output rather than the amount of hours worked. So I do think that this is kind of connected already to some things we've discussed earlier. I would say this is a more like micro view, right? Instead of like your years of loyalty, it's about the amount of times or hours that you put in. So I also want to ask here, because I have my own like perspective of where this motion might come from, and I think that's the idea of, some people get paid per hour, but if they finish the work faster, then they finish the work sooner, and then they don't get paid so much, right? I think that becomes a hard thing to juggle. But with your experience in HR and working in different companies, what context or situation like brought about this idea and made you turn it into a motion?
I think it's largely inspired by the fact that, so it's not so much on personal experience actually, but noticing like how employees would like, obviously this debate is not about companies who are already paying people based on the number of products that they are, let's say, producing, right? So this would specifically apply to companies or organizations that pay people on hourly basis, which is the majority of the companies anyway. So in that case, you would like immediately think of this not so much on, let's say, factory workers, because they are indeed, let's say, their performance evaluation is mostly indeed based on how many, let's say, goods they can produce in a
Yeah,
certain
yeah.
amount, right? But when it comes to, let's say, quote unquote, I hate this term, but white collar workers who are working
Mm-hmm.
office job, in which they will have like, usually they are measured from how much they can do in 9 to 5, and then companies would create evaluation measurement system like KPI or OKR or things like that in order to see how successful you have been. Most of the time, this is also not directly like tied to how productive they are on daily basis, because you could argue that, yeah, some work can only be achieved, or at least the results can only be seen in 6 months or 3 months, but that disincentivizes companies from actually making things that are much clearer in terms of what they expect from employees. And that's some sort of miscommunication in terms of how much they need to do, what they need to do in terms of, let's say, their daily work. So that's basically the main inspiration about how do we make a better working relationship between companies and employees. Because right now it's just that, if, let's say, okay, your target is on quarterly basis, you need to achieve this, sure, that is like something that you can see in a 3-month time. But in
Mm-hmm.
order for you to achieve, you need to have some sort of clear outline as well in terms of what you're going to do on daily basis, right? How many client meetings you're going to get, how many, let's say, sales pitch you're going to make in a day or things like that, because those quarterly numbers would not suddenly come out of thin air. So in that regard, under this proposal, I would say, in that case, workers will have to receive a very clear outline of things that they need to do per day and things that they need to achieve on a daily basis in order for them to, or I don't know, weekly, monthly, whatever. But the point being is about how then they will be able to plan out a lot of things in order to achieve certain goal. Because one person could achieve, let's say, all of their sales target or any of their target, depending on their position, in 3 months, but they could do it on like just 1 week because they have been procrastinating. Some people are good at that, and we're not saying that these people are not deserving in terms of any sort of higher payment. But technically, then, if they can only do it in 1 week, we are wasting our, let's say, resources. The companies are wasting resources to pay these people for like the whole previous 2 months. So in that case, maybe then we need to evaluate the way we engage with this particular position. If someone can do it in 1 week, maybe we just need to hire a temporary worker instead of hiring a full-time position, all of these things. So that's why I think that in that case, this debate is largely about how do we measure productivity and how can we eventually find out if employees are living through their utmost potential.
Yeah, you did mention something super interesting, which is, companies maximizing the time of their employees. So I do think that is a problem, especially in like Philippine industries where a lot of high level positions, like they get work done in 1 week, but we pay them for like the entire year. They get so much bonuses. So that's like the pragmatic end of it. But I do want to know, how do you win the frame on fairness, right? So we've already limited it to workers that do have like outputs that are currently not being accounted for, maybe. So let's say quote unquote white collar workers, for instance. But how do you make sure that it's fair? Because in prop, I can imagine probable argument from op would be the idea of, sometimes just things happen, like you put in all the work, the sale doesn't push through, and then you're out of your commission for the month or the week. And that might
Mm-hmm.
not be seen as unfair. But on op, it might also be kind of unfair if we don't base it on output, because someone can just laze around, or I know they won't, right? There's performance reviews, but that is a possibility that prop has to prepare for. So how do you frame it on prop to make it look fair? And how would you do it on opposition as well?
That's the thing, right? I think that they really need to identify what output really means, because work outputs can also be broken down into several pieces. Like the examples that I gave earlier would be about, let's say, sales target, right? But sales target, again, will not come out of thin air. So you need to have enough pitch, enough proposals being sent, enough client meetings, enough people that you're interacting with, enough, let's say, conferences or events that you come in order to network with different people. These things can be considered as output as well, right? Generating new names or new client names, new client contacts, new client details, and all of that. But then again, this is a very sales specific example. But then output can also be like framed into not just like an actual numbers, because like you said, it's unfair to really expect people to suddenly like have numbers, and then they would leave a lot of room for opposition to just say that, oh, fabrication, falsification, and some sort of negative coalition, not coalition, what do you call it? Like collusion or things like that. So in that case, they really need to frame that output is not just always like the final numbers, but any sub output that would lead to the end output can be considered as an actual work as well. So obviously, in that case, for someone who, let's say, makes money for the company by being a salesperson, but they only meet one client, and that one client generates like 50% of the overall company revenue, you could say that that person also just got lucky. And it's also unfair then for people who like have a lot of client meetings, a lot of events that they are attending just so they can network with more people, but then cannot generate as much as revenue. It's also unfair in the current system. So that's why then in that case, in order for fairness, if anything, that this is the best way for us to really understand how people give and how people can ensure their own productivity with their own autonomy of fulfilling all of these things in a particular time frame.
All right. So I think one last question, because I think we have covered quite a lot in the few questions I've already asked. I guess one
Mhm.
angle I am curious about is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but at least in the Philippines, a lot of pay or salaries are not just determined by what you're able to do, but they also kind of pay you for your experience, right? Like things that you've done, like your CV, how strong it is. There's also this element of like locking you in, like they pay you not just for your output, but because they don't want other companies to be able to get you. So I'm not sure if that's like a common practice everywhere, but it is a big deal here in the Philippines. So I'm curious, how will that change if you start compensating based on output? Is there a risk, for example, of your past experiences no longer like mattering? Or is there a way to balance that? Or do you think prop just has to accept that, okay, your experience levels are probably going to be put in the back seat because we want to prioritize the outputs and the things that we can see?
Very, very fair question. It also like brings up something that I want to discuss about this motion as well. It's just that in the current world that we live in, not all companies are required to disclose their salary range, right? That's why it's very easy for you to just like, quote unquote, manipulate employees to stay
Oh
by
yeah.
giving them a lot of money in
Mm-mm.
order for them to like stay, and then they will not take a look at other opportunities. But when it's already based on output, right? Then output is something that you can easily measure across all companies, because sometimes companies even like not copy and paste necessarily, but if it's a similar position, then most likely the expectations are almost similar, aside from the fact that probably depending on the company size, the sales target will be different, or depending on any position that you have. But the point being is that if, let's say, it's currently now being measured by output, if anything, that you could argue for even a more equitable salary range, because sometimes when we talk about experience, CV, and all of that, which I think is very fair, and I think that most workplaces are still adopting the policy, they want to give you that amount of money for what you have gained throughout the years. But sometimes you're not even sure if, let's say, the standard or the range being used from the person's or the employees previous companies or even before that are necessarily objective as well in terms of measuring how much they can be productive for the company. So in that case, this would make some sort of an equitable, let's say, discourse or even like an immediate impact on salary range for similar positions across different industries that would make it even more objective in a way that some people are indeed overpaid. Some people can be underpaid depending on the standard. But now that we're able to measure people based on output, because now it also changes on the way people write their CVs, right? They will not just like write some random, or I would say abstract things like achievement. I managed to reform the company's policies that increase the employees, let's say, engagement rate or things like that. So now, because people are going to be evaluated based on output, they will have to put more details into these are the things that I do to achieve this particular thing. And because of that, the companies are able to evaluate better. Oh, well, in that case, because that's the standard that you're at right now, these are the pay that we can provide because that's something that is acceptable in terms of, let's say, the range for this particular position in that particular industry. So that's something you're not necessarily moving the experience, but rather you are making those experiences and your past achievements into a more objective measurement rather than just like making people, have the room to just like, yeah, I did this in my company and therefore I deserve this amount of pay. But then, well, you cannot really see it, right? Because you don't know what they do on a daily basis. You do not know how much they're putting their efforts into that particular venture or things like that. So yeah, that's my
All right.
thoughts.
So I think we covered quite a lot. I do want to wrap this up with a question that I'm sure a lot of our novices in the tournament are wondering, which is, we have a lot of experience because we have been in a lot of different workplaces, we have work experience. But if you are completely new, let's say we have people here that are still in high school, right? So what advice would you give them? Because these arguments might not be very easy for them to think of given their lack of experience. So is there something that they can read or look at, or is there a particular mindset that they can have to, come up with arguments easier, or at least make this much more relatable to them during preparation time?
For sure. I think for things that they can take a look into would be about, I think, the phenomenon about how companies are paying people right now, or more like any discussion about equitable salary or equitable pay or things like that. Or even like they can read more about the gender pay gap issue that I think would be relevant as well as a knowledge in this motion. Or at least knowing that, knowing this context would really help as well in terms of why then the current system about hourly work is unfair, let's say, for proposition. And opposition can also read things about why then it can potentially be inequitable or even unfair. But secondly, in terms of mindset or things that they need to have in mind when they, let's say, when we are doing the motion release and they see this motion set and they're like, what even is the status quo, right? Well, I think that in that case, just focus on the wording, in which, like, even if you're not exactly sure what is the status quo, at least the motion is very specific in terms of comparative. It's output versus hours. So then just like focus on world building, right? On focusing what does it mean for people to be paid on output, based on output, and what does it mean for people to be based on hourly basis, which most of the time like is already fixed or things like that. So just focus on the keywords of the motion and then do world building according to what is being requested or demanded from the motion. And I think teams would do well, even when they're, let's say, inexperienced in terms of this overall knowledge about how workers are being compensated or paid.
All right, thank you very much. Let's now move on to our last motion in the set. It reads, this House would allow managerial employees to unionize. The info slide says that currently, under the labor laws of majority of countries, only non-managerial employees, i.e. employees without leadership capacities or responsibilities, are allowed to unionize. So I think the most important thing here, right, to establish is sort of the context or frame. The info slide does provide us with what is happening now, but I am curious, like, for, I guess, for both prop and op, right? The question is, do we still need this policy? So the question I have is, why did we have this rule to begin with? Like, that was always something I was also curious about. Why is it that managerial employees in status quo are not given the opportunity or even ability to unionize?
So under a couple of labor laws that at least I'm aware of, the reason that why they're not allowed is because the labor laws assume that they are already part of the company management in a way that they somewhat help shape the policies or the directives of the organization. So therefore, if they're unionized, then there would be some sort of severe clash of interests. But then again, if you notice that some labor laws are not very specific in terms of why then it could constitute a clash of interests. So that's why then this debate happens.
Yeah, so I think from propositions, and why do you think, or what's the principle here, right? Why should we allow that, even if it does run the risk of being a conflict of interest? Or I think another angle here would be that it does mess up a company quite a bit, right? If your upper management is the one unionizing. So, in principle, why do we allow it, or why should prop allow it to happen?
Right. So in that case, it's important to contextualize that managerial position or supervisory position, if you will, or people with leadership capabilities are not always in the upper management. They can be in the lower management. Let's say, for example, a factory manager or even any type of manager that only have like the direct labor force, if you will. So in that case, they're not always that up high in a way that sometimes they're also just receive orders. They're just like, hey, this is the new policies that I received from the director or from the VP or whoever or the head, and therefore we need to do this. But at the same time, sometimes they also have no direct say in that, which means that in that case, they are also locked out from the ability to have some sort of protection in the form of union because they are considered to be part of the organization as opposed to being the labor force. So that's why I think that the principle behind that is that it's somewhat unfair to blanketly, if that's a word, recognize any supervisory position, no matter their rank in the hierarchy of the organization, is then automatically locked out from actually joining a union that otherwise could protect them from unfair practices in the organization or even just ask for certain rights, right? So that would be the principle that I had in mind.
And I want to ask also the pragmatic parts for proposition, because having a union does come with particular benefits. And a lot of our, people debating here, maybe this is their first time encountering like the idea of a union. Hopefully not. I hope you guys were reading, but I wouldn't be surprised if this is a novel concept to you. So I do want to ask, like, I guess in general, what are the main elements of a union that you think proposition need to emphasize as a big change that really would improve either their position or their their ability to work in a company? So I guess, what is it with a union that we need it so much?
So obviously, it's more on the bargaining or collective bargaining power. Because right now, if let's say you rely on, there are multiple unions, right? They could be like unions for certain position, irrespective of the company. There are some countries that allow unions per company basis or things like that. So it just depends. But the things I would say the significance of having a collective bargaining position against companies' regulations, in which then in that case, even managerial people from different companies in the same industry can also then unionize in terms of, let's say, voicing out concerns on managerial practices that companies have in that particular industry or things like that. So in that case, the collective bargaining position is often overlooked because obviously like things like minimum wage or even hours worked or PTOs or paid time offs are mostly results of labor workforce banding together in a union. So there's a lot of, let's say, national labor policies that are results of people bargaining together. And if, let's say, managerial positions are now allowed to do so, they're also able to unlock some potential opportunities where managerial decisions or even things that are like that the labor force that are now allowed to unionize cannot necessarily influence, can also be a part of what is being discussed or negotiated when needed.
All right. I guess before we go to like the other types of arguments that prop can run, I am now curious on the principle of opposition, because given the strong frame you provided for proposition that a lot of managerial or supervising positions are not that high up, right? They still have to report to the head office or whoever the VP or president is. So currently, it does have a bit of a trade-off, right? Like if you accept this position, you are giving up your ability to have a union. I guess from the perspective of op, how do they justify that this is a fair thing to give up, right? Why is it fair for op to still like uphold this policy that they should not be allowed to unionize or have like collective bargaining power?
Mm-hmm. So I think that in that case, if anything, it will only the principle that opposition can run is that number one, it gives us some sort of illusion to managerial employees that they have the same sort of, I would say, quote unquote, plights or struggles with the labor force under them in a way that they do not necessarily represent the same interests, and therefore, if they're allowed to unionize, it will only make things worse when it comes to how unions in general engage with organizations or industries, because they could represent vastly different interests, even if, let's say, they are still quite low in the hierarchy, but that does not mean that they're representing the interests of the workers. The reason that why labor laws today exist and explicitly mention that at least some nations, right, supervisory or managerial employees cannot unionize is exactly because of that, because that would muddle out a lot of the negotiating process, especially when the labor force union is trying to negotiate on something and then the middle management is trying to negotiate on one thing as well, because they also have different expectations for their roles, which means that they need to make sure that whatever is going on under the department or the division that they're leading is also like fulfilling their duties or responsibilities. And therefore, that's the principle of conflict of interest in a way that it will only cause complication in the negotiating process if there are indeed differences of interest. And it's very likely for those interests to clash with one another because there are additional responsibilities for them as managers and expectations. So it could only put them in some sort of a very disadvantageous or even in a very uncomfortable position should they be allowed to unionize. And that's why they're not allowed to, in a way that they could be the one engaging with their labor force in a more amicable manner because they are in direct relationships with the labor force because of their position at the current moment.
And so that's like one of the core arguments from opposition, right? Like the prevention of complications, the prevention of harm. Is there a benefit though to not being in a union that opposition teams can leverage, right? Like, is there something that you lose when you are part of a union that otherwise managerial employees can gain specifically by being outside of one? So I guess to summarize, what are some benefits of not being in a union that you think op can capitalize on or emphasize?
Right. So being in a managerial position in a particular company might come with different expectations on their duties and the roles that obviously are within the interest of the employee, in this case, the manager or supervisor, to fulfill in order for them to succeed in that particular role. So being a part of the union makes it a little bit tricky, especially in unions where it is, first of all, company level, because obviously managers exist because they're expected to lead particular departments or division in a way that it might not intertwine well with other managers from other department. So if they're a part of a union, it might hamper the way they're doing their work when they're not necessarily, let's say, affected by certain company policies or regulations or whatever. And in that case, it might disrupt their overall working rhythm. So that's why not being in a union actually helps them to solve the problems on their own, right? When they're able to engage or negotiate with the labor force that they are responsible for, as opposed to being part of one. But if we are seeing on a larger scale the benefits of not being a part of a union, let's say in an industry level, same thing. So managers in one company are already, let's say, not similar in terms of plights or struggles, but at the same time, even companies who operate in the same industry and the managers inside those companies might also not have some sort of similarities, even when, let's say, their titles are similar. But so in that case, if they're a part of a union and the union is, let's say, marching or even protesting or striking, right? In that case, they are obliged to also not cross the picket line. And in that case, it might affect the way they do their work, even when, let's say, they're not necessarily affected because of some companies are not being very fair. And it might also affect them. That's why the principle of giving some sort of disillusionment would be one of the strongest impact, or even a principle, I would say, that opposition can also run.
All right, I think most of my specific questions have been covered. But again, I am not an expert here. So there might be many, many more angles that I'm missing out on. So I guess to wrap this up, I do want to ask you, what are things that prop can explore further that we were not able to talk about yet? And the same goes for opposition. So what other arguments or extensions or like frames can both teams explore further?
Sure. So I think that further extension that we can think of that is not related to the labor force union, to the managerial union, and also to the company overall, it's also something about the, what do you call it? Why am I blanking? Oh, the labor regulations as well. It's something that teams can talk about in terms of, let's say, how countries would approach their labor laws and how any future amendments or additions to the laws would be affected. Because after all, there are now additional voices that are going to be a part of the collective bargaining position in the form of this new unions, if you will. So in that case, it might be part of the discussion as well. I would say another aspect that I think debaters might want to talk, might not might want, but might talk about is the effects of unions, strikes, and consumers. I think it is a possible extension about how then consumers are likely to be put in a, not in a more uncomfortable position, but rather how they would be affected if there are more strikes because there are more clashing interests, if you will. So in that case, it might be part of the debate, but I don't think it is the most important. So I would say that probably that part can be, used if everything else has been discussed. But again, I think that there are a lot of areas where they talk about the labor force, the existing labor force, the managerial people, the companies, and also the overall, the overarching, whatever the way you pronounce it, labor laws in general could also be part of the debate.
All right. Thank you very much. I guess we'll wrap up here. And I have a question we ask all of our motion contributors, which is, we have a lot of novices or people that maybe they have just started out, or maybe they've reached a point where they don't know how else to improve. And I know I've been there, and I'm sure you have been there as well, as someone who, had a time where they weren't that great at debate before improving
Mhm.
significantly. So, what one piece of advice would you give people who are just starting their debate journeys to maybe have fun with it or improve with it?
I have two general advice. Number one, always remind yourself why you are doing this sport. Sometimes it's very easy to forget why are we even debating to begin with. Like for me personally, it's because the joy of actually speaking up, because I guess you can relate as well that we don't have a lot of platforms to actually speak on things that we rarely speak about on a larger scale because of our governments or something, right? Emphasis on the clearing
Mm-hmm.
throat. But in that case, that's what reminds me all the time. Like I like speaking up about these things. But then if you're getting way too competitive, sometimes it's very easy to get lost in the way and forget why you're here to begin with. So always remind yourself the things that you're grateful for when it comes to continuing debating or starting debating to begin with. That's the first thing. Secondly, I think that this is, I would say, the most common one is how easy debating would, I don't know, give you the urge to beat yourself up because it's so easy to see the negatives, right? Oh, my arguments could have been better, my responses could have been better, even my replies could have been better. And those are the things that you would immediately hear, probably from your coach, probably from your partners, probably from the judges that were judging your debate. So these things, it's very important to somewhat I would say not rewire, but see it in a different light. Because when you're receiving all of this feedback, think of it as a way for you to personally grow. And instead of like thinking that you are not doing something particularly good enough, then you see that, oh, there's something that I could have done more. So you really need to quote unquote gaslight yourself. Otherwise, you're going to just, I don't know, be drowned in a rabbit hole of self-disappointment and self-regret for not doing more. But that would be a very, very dark hole that you don't want to jump into. So always remind yourself that these things are for your own good. And it's not to bring you down per se, but rather, if anything, it's a bigger opportunity for you to keep going. So do not beat yourself up. It's very, very normal for you to feel like you're not doing enough. But the fact that you're here, the fact that you're speaking on things that you're uncomfortable with, probably like things they're not aligned with your personal opinion or things like that, that is already amazing. And not everyone can do that. So do remember that. And I do think that there's a last thing that I would like to add. I know I said two, but I have another one.
Go
And
ahead.
this one will be pretty short, but here's the thing. I know probably you are like bored of hearing this from a lot of people that debating is beneficial for you in what sort of way. But people opt into certain hobbies or certain activities because either they enjoy it or they are expecting a return out of it. If you are enjoying debating, then I believe that this is not for you. But if you are like expecting to get a return out of debate, remember that the result, the return that you want to yield will not happen overnight. It happens like on a after thorough training, after failure, after getting back up and all of that. But I can assure you that one day it will all be rewarding. You will look back and these are the things that I did, and these are the things that I owe to who I am now in a way that I am very like whenever I see people succeeding because of well, in some ways that debating helped them to be who they are and to achieve their own greatness, that could also be one thing that motivate you, that what debating gives to you is probably long term, but when it is rewarding, it is that rewarding. That's it.
All right. Thank you very much. I relate 100% to what you said. I wish like my older, or like not older, but my younger version, the me from a few years ago, could hear your advice because I really needed it. So thank you very much, Omar, for giving me your time today and for giving us your amazing motions. I'm sure our participants are going to enjoy or have enjoyed the round. And if they had some questions, I'm pretty sure a lot of them have been covered in this episode. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. All the best for the tournament. Bye bye.
Bye.